Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Miss Marple and the Halloween Fête murder. Welcome to Mindful Musings. I'm your host, William, and I'm delighted you've joined us this evening. Before we begin tonight's mystery, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below. I always enjoy discovering where our stories travel. Now, settle into your favourite chair, perhaps with a warm drink, and let us begin this tale of autumn mischief and murder in the village of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 1. Bobbing for apples and a body in the tub. The October afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular golden quality that makes autumn in the English countryside so beautiful. Miss Jane Marple adjusted the black witch's hat that Mrs. Bantry had insisted she wear, and surveyed the church hall with quiet satisfaction. The Women's Institute had outdone themselves this year with the Halloween Fête decorations. Paper bats dangled from the rafters, carved pumpkins grinned from every available surface, and strings of orange and black bunting transformed the familiar space into something appropriately festive. The hall buzzed with cheerful activity as villagers arrived in various states of costume. Children darted between the game stalls with painted faces and excited squeals, while their parents lingered over the refreshment table where Mrs. Price Ridley was dispensing mulled cider with her usual efficiency. The scent of toffee apples and gingerbread mingled pleasantly with the earthy smell of autumn leaves that had been scattered artfully across the floor for atmosphere. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the apple-bobbing tub, ostensibly to supervise the game, but in reality to observe the various interactions that such gatherings inevitably produced. Human nature, she had long ago discovered, revealed itself most clearly during community celebrations when normal restraints were loosened by festivity and costume. The apple-bobbing tub itself was an impressive affair, a large galvanized wash-tub that had been borrowed from old Henderson's farm and filled nearly to the brim with cold water. Dozens of bright red apples bobbed merrily on the surface, and a small queue of children waited impatiently for their turn to plunge their faces into the chilly water in pursuit of the elusive fruit. Among the adults present, Miss Marple had noted several interesting undercurrents that suggested the evening might prove more eventful than a simple harvest celebration. Mr. Gerald Thornton, the new estate agent who had recently opened offices on the High Street, stood near the raffle table engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Colonel Bantry. The Colonel's normally florid face had taken on an even deeper shade of red, and his gestures suggested considerable agitation. Near the entrance, Miss Felicity Dane, the village's amateur dramatics director, held court with her usual theatrical flair. Her elaborate fairy godmother costume, complete with wand and tiara, sparkled under the electric lights, though Miss Marple noticed that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she glanced toward Mr. Thornton. There had been talk in the village about Miss Dane's financial difficulties following the failure of her London theatrical venture, and rumours suggested that Mr. Thornton had been less than sympathetic when she'd approached him about extending her lease on the cottage she rented. Also present was young Timothy Wick, who worked as Mr. Thornton's clerk and had been courting Miss Dane's niece Sarah, much to the aunt's apparent disapproval. The young man looked decidedly uncomfortable in his hastily assembled vampire costume, and he kept casting anxious glances between his employer and the object of his affections. Mrs. Bantry bustled over to where Miss Marple stood, her cheerful expression suggesting she was thoroughly enjoying herself. The older woman wore a rather magnificent costume as the Queen of Hearts, complete with a crown fashioned from cardboard and painted gold. "Isn't it all perfectly splendid, Jane?" she exclaimed, surveying the crowded hall with evident pride. "I do think this is the best fête we've organised in years. Everyone seems to be having such a wonderful time." Miss Marple smiled in agreement, though her keen blue eyes continued to observe the various groupings around the hall. "Indeed, Dolly, the decorations are particularly effective, though I must say that apple-bobbing tub looks rather deep. I do hope the children are being properly supervised." Mrs. Bantry waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson is keeping a close eye on things. You know how careful she is with the youngsters. Besides, it's all part of the traditional fun, isn't it?" At that moment, the small brass band that had been providing background music launched into a particularly enthusiastic rendition of a popular tune, and several couples began to dance in the space that had been cleared for the purpose. The festive atmosphere seemed to intensify, and even Miss Marple found herself tapping her foot to the lively rhythm. It was approaching 7 o'clock when Mr. Thornton, having apparently concluded his discussion with Colonel Bantry, made his way toward the apple-bobbing station. He had eschewed costume in favour of his usual impeccable business attire, though someone had persuaded him to wear a small black mask that gave him the appearance of a rather well-dressed highwayman. "Right then," he announced jovially to the small crowd that had gathered. "Who says adults can't have a go at this? I haven't bobbed for apples since I was a lad. Let's see if I've still got the knack." Several people laughed and encouraged him, including Miss Dane, whose expression Miss Marple found curiously difficult to interpret. There was something in the woman's smile that suggested anticipation of an altogether different sort than simple amusement. Mr. Thornton removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves with theatrical flair, then knelt before the tub with exaggerated concentration. The crowd pressed closer to watch, blocking Miss Marple's view somewhat, though she could hear the splashing and the good-natured cheering as he plunged his face into the water. The cheering continued for perhaps 15 seconds, then began to fade into uncertain laughter as Mr. Thornton remained submerged. Someone called out a joke about his determination, but the laughter was already taking on a nervous quality. It was young Timothy who first realized something was wrong. He stepped forward and touched Mr. Thornton's shoulder, then immediately recoiled with a cry of alarm. "He's not moving. Someone help me." What followed happened with the horrible slowness that characterizes true emergencies. Several men rushed forward to pull Mr. Thornton from the tub, water cascading across the wooden floor as they lifted his limp form. Dr. Haydock, who had been enjoying a glass of cider near the refreshment table, pushed through the crowd with his medical bag already in hand. Miss Marple watched the doctor's face as he conducted his brief examination, noting the way his expression shifted from concern to grim certainty. When Dr. Haydock finally looked up and caught her eye, she saw her own suspicions confirmed in his troubled gaze. "I'm afraid Mr. Thornton is dead," the doctor announced quietly to the hushed crowd. "It appears he's drowned." A collective gasp arose, followed by shocked murmurs and the beginning of what would undoubtedly become widespread panic. But Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something else entirely, something that struck her as distinctly odd about the circumstances of Mr. Thornton's death. The water that pooled on the floor around his body carried a faint but unmistakable scent, one that didn't belong in a tub meant for a children's game. It was the sharp, alcoholic smell of spirits, and it was far stronger than the trace amounts one might expect from mulled cider-scented hands. Moreover, as the crowd shifted and Miss Marple moved closer, she observed that Mr. Thornton's hands were clenched in a most peculiar manner, as though he had been grasping at something just before his death. Around his neck, barely visible beneath his collar, she could see what appeared to be faint marks, too regular to be accidental bruising. The festive atmosphere had evaporated entirely, replaced by shock and the beginning of fearful speculation. Already she could hear whispers of accidents and tragic mishaps, the natural human desire to explain away horror with comfortable rationalizations. But Miss Marple, who had seen too much of human nature to accept simple explanations, found herself studying the faces around her with renewed attention. Somewhere among these costumed villagers was someone who knew that Mr. Gerald Thornton's death had been anything but accidental. The Halloween Fête had claimed its victim, but Miss Marple was determined it would also reveal its killer. Chapter 2. The Cider That Changed Hands. The immediate aftermath of Mr. Thornton's death brought the controlled chaos that such events inevitably produce. Dr. Haydock had taken charge with admirable efficiency, clearing the area around the body and sending someone to telephone for Inspector Slack. The children had been ushered into the kitchen by several concerned mothers, their excited Halloween spirits dampened by the presence of death, even if they didn't fully understand what had occurred. Miss Marple had remained near the apple-bobbing tub, observing with quiet attention as various individuals reacted to the tragedy. She had learned over the years that the moments immediately following a crime often revealed more than hours of subsequent investigation, as people had not yet had time to compose their faces or consider how their actions might be interpreted. Mrs. Price Ridley stood frozen by the refreshment table, her face pale beneath her elaborate gypsy costume. Her hands trembled as she set down the ladle she'd been using to serve mulled cider, and Miss Marple noticed that her gaze kept returning to the apple-bobbing tub with an expression that suggested more than simple shock. Miss Felicity Dane had sunk into a folding chair near the stage, her fairy godmother wand lying forgotten on the floor beside her. Her theatrical composure had deserted her entirely, and she appeared genuinely distressed, though whether by the death itself or some other consideration, Miss Marple could not immediately determine. Young Timothy Wick paced near the entrance, his vampire cape trailing forgotten behind him, as he ran his hands repeatedly through his hair. Every few moments he would glance toward Sarah Dane, who stood with a group of other young people, her face streaked with tears. Colonel Bantry had taken up a position near the door, apparently to prevent anyone from leaving before the police arrived. His military bearing served him well in the crisis, though Miss Marple observed that his usually hearty manner had been replaced by a grim determination that suggested he was deeply troubled by something beyond the simple tragedy of a man's death. It was while making these observations that Miss Marple became aware of Mrs. Bantry at her elbow, speaking in an urgent whisper. "Jane, this is absolutely dreadful. Poor Mr. Thornton. However could such a thing have happened? The tub wasn't that deep, surely. People bob for apples all the time without drowning." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and regarded her friend with that mild expression that often preceded her most penetrating observations. "Indeed, Dolly, which is precisely why I find myself somewhat puzzled by the circumstances. Tell me, who was responsible for filling the apple-bobbing tub this afternoon?" Mrs. Bantry looked surprised by the question. "Why, old Henderson brought it round this morning already filled. Saved us the trouble of hauling water," he said. "Very kind of him, considering the size of the thing. And the apples were added when?" "Just before the Fête opened. Mrs. Henderson brought those in a basket. Fresh from their orchard," she said. Mrs. Bantry paused, her brow furrowing. "Why do you ask, Jane? Surely you don't think there was something wrong with the water or the apples?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she moved closer to the tub, which still stood where it had been positioned, its water now disturbed and sloshing slightly as people moved past. The apples continued to bob on the surface, their cheerful red skins seeming incongruous against the grim reality of what had just occurred. Bending down as close as her aging knees would permit, Miss Marple detected again that faint alcoholic scent she had noticed earlier. It was definitely stronger than it should have been, and it had a distinctive quality that reminded her of something, though she couldn't immediately place what. "Mrs. Price Ridley," she called gently to the woman still standing immobile by the refreshment table. "Might I trouble you with a question?" The gypsy-costumed woman started as though awakened from a trance, then made her way over with obvious reluctance. "Yes, Miss Marple." Her voice was thin and strained. "I was wondering about the mulled cider you've been serving this evening. Is it the same batch you prepared this morning?" Mrs. Price Ridley's face, already pale, went a shade whiter. That is, there were 2 batches, actually. The first one was, well, there was a problem with it. Too much cinnamon. Quite undrinkable, really. So I made a fresh batch just before the Fête opened." "I see. And what became of the first batch?" I poured it out, down the drain in the kitchen." But her eyes flickered away as she spoke, and Miss Marple recognized the telltale signs of a partial truth. "All of it?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Mrs. Price Ridley's hands twisted together nervously. "Well, not quite all. Mr. Thornton came in while I was preparing the second batch. He said he'd heard we were serving mulled cider and wondered if he might have an early taste. I gave him what was left of the first batch, perhaps a cup or so. He said it was perfectly fine, didn't mention the cinnamon at all." Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. "And this would have been what time?" "Around 5 o'clock, perhaps a bit after. The Fête didn't open until 5:30, you understand." "Quite so. And after Mr. Thornton left with his cup of cider, where did the remainder of that first batch go?" Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated, her discomfort now painfully obvious. I'm not entirely certain. I set the jug aside while I worked on the second batch. When I looked for it again, it had disappeared. I assumed someone had tidied it away or perhaps poured it out as I should have done." Before Miss Marple could pursue this line of questioning further, the arrival of Inspector Slack brought a new bustle of official activity to the hall. The inspector, looking distinctly put out at having his evening disturbed, strode directly to where Dr. Haydock stood guard over the body. Miss Marple observed their consultation with interest, noting the inspector's initially dismissive expression giving way to something more serious as the doctor spoke. After a few moments, Inspector Slack straightened and addressed the assembled crowd. "Right then, I'm afraid no one's to leave just yet. I'll need statements from anyone who was near the apple-bobbing station when the incident occurred." His gaze swept across the costumed villagers with obvious distaste. "And someone fetch me a list of everyone who was present at this affair." As the inspector began organising his investigation, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to a detail she had not previously noticed. Near the base of the apple-bobbing tub, partially hidden by the decorative hay bales that had been arranged around it, lay a small puddle of liquid. It was darker than the water from the tub, with an oily sheen on its surface. Bending down with some difficulty, Miss Marple extended one finger to touch the liquid, then brought it cautiously to her nose. The smell was unmistakable, the same alcoholic scent she had detected in the tub water, but concentrated to a far stronger degree. Someone had added spirits to the apple-bobbing water, and recently enough that traces of the original liquid still remained where it had spilled during the process. But why? What purpose could such an addition serve? Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind working through the implications. The answer, when it came to her, was both simple and chilling. Strong alcohol would have a powerful effect on someone who plunged their face into it unexpectedly, particularly if they inhaled water mixed with spirits. The burning sensation, the shock, the instinctive gasp that would draw the liquid into the lungs. This had been no accident, no simple drowning during a festive game. Someone had deliberately altered the contents of that tub, transforming a harmless Halloween tradition into a deadly trap. The question now was who had done it, and whether they had acted alone or with assistance. Miss Marple glanced around the hall, studying the faces of her fellow villagers with renewed intensity. Somewhere among these witches and vampires, queens and fairies, was someone who had committed murder, and that someone had relied upon the confusion and chaos of a Halloween fete to mask their crime. Chapter 3. A Scarf Discovered in the Kitchen Garden. The following morning brought rain to St. Mary Mead, a steady autumn drizzle that matched the sombre mood that had settled over the village. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind occupied with the various puzzles surrounding Mr. Thornton's death. By 8 o'clock she had abandoned any pretense of rest and was seated at her breakfast table, methodically reviewing what she knew while the rain pattered against her cottage windows. Inspector Slack had kept everyone at the church hall until nearly midnight, taking statements and examining the scene with what Miss Marple had to admit was considerably more thoroughness than she had initially expected. The inspector had been particularly interested in her observation about the alcoholic smell in the apple-bobbing water, and had ordered the entire contents of the tub preserved as evidence. The preliminary findings had been shared with the village through the efficient medium of Mrs. Bantry, who had telephoned Miss Marple first thing that morning with the news. Dr. Haydock's more detailed examination had confirmed that Mr. Thornton had indeed drowned, but with the significant addition that his lungs contained water mixed with a high concentration of apple brandy. Someone had added nearly half a bottle of spirits to the apple-bobbing tub, timing the addition for shortly before Mr. Thornton's fatal attempt at the game. The shock of inhaling the strong alcohol had caused him to gasp and choke, drawing more of the contaminated water into his lungs. In his panicked state, disoriented by the burning sensation and unable to lift his head properly, he had drowned in less than a minute. But what troubled Miss Marple most was the peculiar marks on Mr. Thornton's neck that she had observed during those first chaotic moments. Dr. Haydock had noted them as well, though his official report had been carefully neutral on the subject. They might have been caused by Mr. Thornton's own hands, as he clutched at his throat in his final struggles, or they might suggest something more sinister. It was while pondering these matters that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Young Timothy Wick stood on her doorstep, his hair plastered to his head by the rain, and his expression one of considerable distress. "Miss Marple, I do apologise for calling so early, but I simply must speak with someone. I don't know what to do." Miss Marple ushered him inside and insisted he sit by the fire while she prepared tea. The young man's agitation was evident, and she suspected he carried information that might prove significant to understanding the previous evening's tragedy. "Now then, Mr. Wick," she said gently, once they were both settled with their teacups. "What is troubling you?" Timothy took a shaky breath. It's about Mr. Thornton, Miss Marple. About what happened last night. I'm afraid I may know something important, but I don't know if I should tell the police. It might make things worse for someone I care about." Miss Marple recognised the moral dilemma facing the young man. "Perhaps you might tell me first, and we can consider together what should be done with the information." Timothy nodded gratefully. "It's about the apple-bobbing tub, you see. I was helping set up the games in the afternoon, and I noticed something odd. When old Henderson delivered the tub that morning, it was only about half full, but by the time the Fête opened, it was nearly to the brim." "Someone added more water during the afternoon," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, but that's not all. I saw Miss Dane, Sarah's aunt, in the kitchen garden behind the church hall around 4 o'clock. She was pouring something from a bottle into a watering can. When she saw me, she looked quite startled and quickly put the bottle away. Said she was just preparing some water for the plants, though I thought it odd she'd be gardening on the day of the Fête." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "What sort of bottle was it?" "A dark glass bottle, like the ones they use for spirits. And now that I think about it, there was a smell, something sweet and alcoholic." Timothy's face was troubled. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but after what happened to Mr. Thornton, and with the police saying there was brandy in the tub—" "Did you mention this to Miss Dane?" "No, I hurried away. I was supposed to be helping with the decorations, and I didn't want to seem like I was spying on her." Timothy paused. "But, Miss Marple, there's more. After Mr. Thornton died, when everyone was in confusion, I saw Miss Dane slip out to the kitchen garden. She was only gone a moment, but when she came back, she no longer had her scarf. She'd been wearing it all evening, a distinctive silk scarf with autumn leaves on it. But it was gone." This was indeed significant. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation. "Mr. Wick, I think you and I should visit the church hall kitchen garden this morning. The rain may have complicated matters, but there may yet be evidence to discover." The kitchen garden behind the church hall was a modest plot where the Women's Institute grew vegetables for their various charitable endeavours. The rain had transformed it into a muddy expanse, but Miss Marple moved through it with determined purpose, her galoshes squelching in the wet earth. Timothy followed close behind, directing her attention to the area where he had seen Miss Dane the previous afternoon. Near an old water barrel stood a watering can, still where it had been left. Miss Marple examined it carefully, noting that while the rain had diluted any contents, there remained a faint sweet smell clinging to the interior. "Someone used this to carry liquid," she observed, "though whether it was water or something else we cannot now determine with certainty." It was while straightening up that she noticed something caught on a nearby rosebush. The fabric was silk, a rich autumn pattern of red and gold leaves, and it was unmistakably part of a scarf that had been torn on the thorns. "Miss Dane's scarf," Timothy breathed, his face pale. Miss Marple carefully freed the fragment from the thorns and wrapped it in her handkerchief. But she found herself troubled by the discovery. The positioning of the fabric suggested that someone had been in rather a hurry when they passed the rosebush, catching the scarf accidentally rather than deliberately, removing it. "Mr. Wick," she said slowly, "are you quite certain it was Miss Dane you saw here yesterday afternoon?" "Well, I saw someone in her costume. She was wearing that distinctive fairy godmother outfit with the tiara. Who else could it have been?" "Quite so. But costumes can be borrowed or stolen, particularly in the confusion of preparing for a large gathering." Miss Marple studied the young man carefully. "Tell me, what time did you arrive at the church hall yesterday?" "Around 2 o'clock. I was helping Colonel Bantry move some of the heavier items." "And Miss Dane's costume, when did you first observe her wearing it?" Timothy frowned, concentrating. "I don't recall seeing her in costume until much later, perhaps 4:30 or 5 o'clock. Before that, she was in her ordinary clothes, overseeing the decoration arrangements." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. This suggested a gap in the afternoon during which anyone might have borrowed Miss Dane's distinctive costume, committed their suspicious activities in the garden, and returned it before being noticed. "There's something else," Timothy added hesitantly. "Mr. Thornton and Miss Dane had been arguing recently. Everyone in the village knew about it. He was threatening to evict her from the cottage she rents unless she paid several months of back rent immediately. She'd been saying terrible things about him, calling him a heartless money grubber." Miss Marple absorbed this information while continuing to examine the garden area. The discovery of the scarf fragment raised as many questions as it answered. If Miss Dane was indeed the one who had been in the garden with the bottle and watering can, why had she returned to tear her scarf on the rosebush? Had she forgotten something, or was she attempting to retrieve evidence? Or, Miss Marple thought with growing conviction, had someone else entirely borrowed Miss Dane's costume and scarf specifically to implicate her in the crime? The rain continued to fall as they made their way back toward the village, and Miss Marple found herself considering the various possibilities with increasing concern. The discovery in the kitchen garden pointed toward Miss Dane, but in Miss Marple's experience, evidence that pointed too obviously in one direction often proved to be deliberately misleading. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that Mr. Thornton drowned during what should have been a harmless game. But whether that someone was Miss Dane, or another person entirely, and whether they had acted alone or with an accomplice, remained to be determined. Chapter 4. Muddy Boots Behind the Stage Curtain. Inspector Slack's investigation had proceeded with his characteristic thoroughness, though Miss Marple had observed through the reliable intelligence network of village gossip that he was focusing his attention primarily on Miss Felicity Dane. The discovery of her scarf in the kitchen garden, combined with her well-known disputes with Mr. Thornton over rent arrears, made her the obvious suspect. The inspector had called at Miss Dane's cottage that morning, returning to the station with several items that had been carefully bagged as potential evidence. Among these, Miss Marple had learned from a reliable source, was a half-empty bottle of apple brandy found in Miss Dane's pantry. What troubled Miss Marple about this evidence was not its existence, but rather its convenient location. In her experience, those who committed murder took considerably more care in disposing of incriminating materials than simply leaving them where they might be easily discovered by the first person who thought to look. It was this reflection that led her to return to the church hall on the afternoon following the murder. The building stood empty in the grey October light, the festive decorations from the previous evening looking forlorn and rather macabre in the circumstances. Yellow police tape barred the main entrance, but Miss Marple had obtained a key from the vicar, who saw no harm in allowing her to collect some knitting she claimed to have left behind during the confusion. The hall's interior felt cold and slightly damp, with that peculiar emptiness that comes to public spaces when deprived of their usual occupants. The apple-bobbing tub had been removed by the police, leaving only a damp patch on the wooden floor to mark where it had stood. Miss Marple moved past this spot with deliberate care, her destination being the small storage area behind the stage curtain, where props and equipment for various village productions were kept. She had remembered something from the previous evening, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on greater importance. During the confusion following Mr. Thornton's death, she had observed someone moving behind the stage curtain, their passage betrayed by a slight ripple in the fabric. At the time, she had assumed it was merely someone seeking a moment of privacy to compose themselves, but now she wondered if there might have been a more practical purpose to that movement. The area behind the curtain was shadowy and cluttered, filled with the accumulated detritus of numerous village entertainments. Painted scenery flats leaned against the walls, costume racks stood crowded with various garments, and props of every description filled wooden crates and cardboard boxes. Miss Marple began a systematic search, though she was not entirely certain what she hoped to find. She examined the costume racks first, looking for any sign of Miss Dane's fairy godmother outfit, but found only the usual collection of historical costumes and period dress. It was while moving a particularly heavy wooden crate that she discovered the boots. They were men's Wellington boots, size 10 or 11 by the look of them, and they were liberally coated with mud that was still damp enough to leave marks on the floor. More significantly, the mud had a distinctive, reddish tinge that Miss Marple immediately recognized as characteristic of the clay soil found in the church hall kitchen garden. She examined the boots more carefully, noting that the mud was concentrated primarily on the toes and along the sides, suggesting that someone had been kneeling in the garden rather than simply walking through it. There were also traces of what appeared to be grass clippings and a few thorns caught in the rubber treads. The discovery raised immediate questions. Who did these boots belong to? They were too large to belong to Miss Dane, and the masculine style suggested they were more likely worn by a man. Yet they had been hidden behind the stage curtain, presumably by someone who wished to conceal evidence of their activities in the garden. Miss Marple considered the implications while continuing her search. If these boots had been worn by someone visiting the garden around the time that Timothy Wick had observed the figure in Miss Dane's costume, it suggested that at least 2 people might have been involved in the preparation of the crime. One person wearing the costume to be observed and thus to implicate Miss Dane, while another person, wearing these boots, carried out the actual task of adding the brandy to the apple-bobbing tub. But this raised the question of timing. The tub would have needed to be contaminated relatively close to when Mr. Thornton attempted to bob for apples, otherwise the alcohol would have dissipated or been detected by other participants in the game. Yet Timothy had observed the figure in the garden at 4 o'clock, more than 3 hours before the fatal incident. Miss Marple was pondering this puzzle when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the stage area. She quickly positioned herself where she could observe, without being immediately visible, her curiosity aroused by who might be visiting the hall at this hour. The curtain was pushed aside and Colonel Bantry entered, moving with the careful stealth of someone who did not wish to be observed. He looked around the cluttered space with obvious purpose, his gaze searching for something specific. When his eyes fell upon the spot where the muddy boots had been, Miss Marple saw his expression change from determination to alarm. "Looking for something, Colonel?" she inquired mildly, stepping forward from her place of concealment. Colonel Bantry started violently, his ruddy face going pale and then flushing an even deeper red than usual. "Miss Marple, good Lord, you gave me quite a turn. What are you doing here?" "Retrieving some knitting I left behind. And you?" The Colonel's eyes darted to where Miss Marple stood, and she realized that she was positioned directly in front of the boots. His expression suggested a man caught in an extremely uncomfortable position. That is, I thought I might have left my pipe here last evening. These events, you know, things get misplaced in all the confusion." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed, pleasantly. "Though I must say I haven't observed you smoking a pipe recently, Colonel. I thought you'd given it up on Dr. Haydock's advice." The Colonel's discomfort increased visibly. "Yes, well, old habits, you understand." Miss Marple decided that directness might serve better than circumspection. "Colonel Bantry, these boots behind me, do they belong to you?" The Colonel's face worked through several expressions before settling on something between defiance and resignation. "Yes, confound it, they're mine. Left them here after helping set up yesterday afternoon. Thought I'd better collect them before anyone started asking awkward questions." "Awkward questions about why your boots are covered in mud from the church hall kitchen garden?" Colonel Bantry sat down heavily on a nearby prop chest, his military bearing deserting him entirely. "Miss Marple, I give you my word as a gentleman, I had nothing to do with Thornton's death. But I can see how those boots might look given the circumstances." "Perhaps you might explain what you were doing in the garden yesterday afternoon." The Colonel sighed deeply. "It's rather embarrassing, actually. You see, I'd been having words with Thornton earlier in the week. He'd been spreading rumours about my financial situation, suggesting I might not be good for certain debts. Absolute nonsense, of course, but damaging nonetheless. Yesterday afternoon I saw him arrive at the church hall early before the Fête opened. I thought I might catch him alone and have it out with him properly." "And did you?" "Never got the chance. I went round to the garden, thinking he might have gone that way to avoid the main entrance where people were still setting up. But when I got there, I saw someone else approaching the area near the water barrel. I didn't want to be observed having a private conversation with Thornton, so I stayed out of sight behind the tool shed." "Who did you see?" "That's just it. I couldn't tell. They were wearing one of those blasted costumes, made it impossible to identify them properly. But they were carrying something, a bottle and a watering can. I watched them pour liquid from the bottle into the can, then they hurried away toward the hall." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing interest. "What time was this?" "Around 4 o'clock, perhaps a few minutes after. I waited until they'd gone, then made my way back into the hall through the side entrance. Left the boots behind the curtain because I didn't want anyone asking why they were muddy." "Did you notice whether this person was wearing a particular costume?" Colonel Bantry frowned in concentration. "It might have been a fairy costume. There were wings, I think, or something that glittered in the light. But I couldn't swear to it. The light in the garden wasn't particularly good, and I was more concerned with not being seen myself." Miss Marple considered this new information carefully. Colonel Bantry's account corroborated. Timothy Wick's observation of someone in Miss Dane's costume working in the garden at 4 o'clock, but it also raised new questions about the Colonel's own involvement. Had he truly been an innocent observer, or had he seen an opportunity to commit murder and attempted to create a false witness account to establish his innocence? "Colonel, did you see Mr. Thornton at all during this time?" "That's the odd thing. I never did see him, despite thinking he'd gone to the garden. When I got back inside, I found him talking with Mrs. Price Ridley in the kitchen. Been there the whole time, apparently, sampling her mulled cider." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. If Mr. Thornton had been in the kitchen with Mrs. Price Ridley at 4 o'clock, then whoever was in the garden could not have been meeting with him, as might have been assumed. Instead, they must have been acting independently, preparing something that would only come to fruition later in the evening. "Colonel Bantry," Miss Marple said carefully, "I think you should tell Inspector Slack exactly what you've told me. Your observations may prove crucial to understanding what truly happened." The Colonel's face showed considerable reluctance. "Must I? It will look dashed suspicious, me skulking about in the garden at the very time someone was doctoring that apple-bobbing tub." "The truth often appears suspicious until it is properly understood," Miss Marple replied gently. "And I suspect that withholding information will ultimately prove far more damaging than sharing it, however uncomfortable that may be." As they prepared to leave the church hall, Miss Marple found herself reviewing the evidence that had accumulated over the past day. Someone wearing Miss Dane's costume had been observed in the garden by 2 separate witnesses at 4 o'clock. Colonel Bantry's muddy boots confirmed his presence as well. The watering can had contained some sort of liquid, presumably the apple brandy that would later be added to the tub, but the timing still troubled her. 3 hours was too long for the contaminated water to remain undetected. Someone must have added the brandy to the tub much closer to 7 o'clock, when Mr. Thornton made his fatal attempt at bobbing for apples, which meant that the activities in the garden at 4 o'clock might have been preparation, but the actual murder required a second visit to complete. Someone had needed to access the tub during the fete itself, while attention was focused elsewhere, and add the contents of that watering can to the water. Miss Marple paused at the door of the church hall, her mind working through the logistics. During the fete, the apple-bobbing station had been in constant view of numerous people. How could anyone have added a significant quantity of liquid to the tub without being observed? Unless, she realized with a sudden chill of certainty, they had done so in plain sight, disguised as something perfectly innocent and in keeping with the festive atmosphere. Chapter 5. The Prank That Went Too Far. The rain had ceased by evening, leaving St. Mary Mead glistening under a watery sunset. Miss Marple sat in contemplation when Dr. Haydock arrived at her door, his expression grave. "Miss Marple, I've just come from the police station. The post-mortem revealed something unexpected." He settled by the fire, accepting tea with distracted thanks. In addition to the apple brandy in Mr. Thornton's lungs, there were traces of capsaicin in high concentration. "Capsaicin?" Miss Marple inquired. "The compound that makes chili peppers hot. Someone added hot pepper extract to the water along with the brandy. The combination would have been excruciating. When Thornton plunged his face in, the burning sensation made him gasp reflexively, inhaling the contaminated water." Miss Marple absorbed this with growing understanding. "Inspector Slack believes this began as a prank?" "Precisely. Someone might have intended merely to give Thornton an unpleasant shock, not realizing the combination with alcohol would prove fatal." Miss Marple recalled the group of young people laughing near the apple-bobbing station shortly before 7 o'clock. At the time, she had dismissed it as harmless Halloween mischief. "Doctor, who among the young people at the fete would have access to concentrated pepper extract?" Haydock frowned. "Young Sarah Dane works part-time at the chemist's shop. They stock various extracts and compounds for culinary use." That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Sarah Dane's lodgings. The young woman answered the door with red-rimmed eyes, clearly distressed by recent events. "Miss Marple, please come in." Once settled, Miss Marple spoke gently. "My dear, I believe you know something about what happened to Mr. Thornton. Something involving a prank that went terribly wrong." Sarah's composure crumbled. "It wasn't supposed to kill him. It was just meant to be funny, to teach him a lesson for being so cruel to Aunt Felicity. Timothy and I thought if we made the water spicy, he'd get a shock when he tried to bob for apples. Everyone would laugh at him for once." You added the pepper extract? Yes, around 6:30. Timothy distracted people while I poured it in. We used a thermos, so no one would notice. But we didn't add any brandy, Miss Marple, I swear it. Just the pepper water. We thought it would burn his face a bit, make him look foolish. We never imagined. Miss Marple studied the girl's anguished face and believed her. Sarah and Timothy had indeed played a cruel prank, but they had not committed murder. Someone else had added the apple brandy, someone who had either known about the young people's plan or had independently decided to contaminate the water with deadly intent. The question now was who had added the alcohol, and whether they had done so knowing about the pepper extract that would make Mr. Thornton gasp and inhale the fatal mixture. Chapter 6. Mrs. Price Ridley's Guilty Secret. The revelation of Sarah and Timothy's prank had complicated the investigation considerably. Inspector Slack, upon learning of their involvement, had initially wanted to arrest them for manslaughter. It took considerable persuasion from Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock to convince him that while the young people had behaved foolishly and cruelly, they had not added the brandy that had actually caused Mr. Thornton's death. Someone else knew about their prank, Miss Marple explained to Mrs. Bantry over morning tea. Someone who saw an opportunity to commit murder while allowing the young people to take the blame. But who, Jane? And how did they know about the pepper extract? Miss Marple had been considering this very question. The answer, she suspected, lay with Mrs. Price Ridley and her mysterious first batch of mulled cider. That afternoon, she called upon Mrs. Price Ridley at her home. The woman looked considerably older than she had just 2 days earlier, her face drawn and her hands trembling as she served tea. Mrs. Price Ridley, I believe you know more about Mr. Thornton's death than you've told the police. The time has come for complete honesty. The woman's teacup rattled in its saucer. I don't know what you mean. The first batch of cider that you claimed was ruined. What really happened to it? Mrs. Price Ridley's face crumpled. I didn't mean any harm. You must believe me. When Mr. Thornton came to sample the cider early, before the fete, I gave him what was left of the first batch. He drank it and said it was perfectly fine, that I was being too particular. And then? He asked if he might take the rest with him, said he'd enjoy it later. I gave him the jug, perhaps 2 pints remaining. I thought nothing of it at the time. She twisted her handkerchief anxiously. But later, during the fete, I saw him near the apple-bobbing tub. He was pouring something into it from a container. When he saw me watching, he smiled and said he was adding some spirit to the proceedings, making a joke of it. Miss Marple leaned forward intently. What time was this? Shortly before 7 o'clock. The children had just finished their round of bobbing, and the adults were beginning to gather for their turn. Did you confront him? I tried to. I went to him and asked what he'd put in the water. He laughed and said it was just a bit of the mulled cider, that it would make the game more interesting. But Miss Marple, that cider had wine in it, and spices. I was worried about the children. What did you do? Mrs. Price Ridley's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I did something terrible. I was so angry with him for being so thoughtless. When he wasn't looking, I added more liquid to the tub. I'd seen those young people, Sarah and Timothy, acting suspiciously with a thermos earlier. I thought they might be planning to add something alcoholic as a prank. So I found their thermos behind the refreshment table and poured it into the tub as well. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. You added the pepper extract that Sarah and Timothy had prepared. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was more spirits, something to dilute what Thornton had added and make it less dangerous for the children. But when he died, when I heard about the pepper and the brandy, I realized what I'd done. I'd made it so much worse. Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Thornton didn't add brandy to that tub. What he poured in was mulled cider with wine. Unpleasant, perhaps, but not fatal. The apple brandy came from somewhere else entirely. The woman stared at her in shock. But then who? That was indeed the question. 3 separate additions had been made to the apple-bobbing water. Mr. Thornton's mulled cider, Sarah and Timothy's pepper extract, courtesy of Mrs. Price Ridley, and someone else's apple brandy, added by an unknown hand at an unknown time. Miss Marple now understood that Mr. Thornton's death had resulted from a tragic confluence of separate actions, none of them individually intended to kill, but collectively creating a perfect storm of fatal circumstances. Chapter 7. The Costume That Changed Hands. Inspector Slack had been notably subdued when Miss Marple shared Mrs. Price Ridley's confession. The realization that 3 separate parties had contaminated the apple-bobbing water, each unaware of the other's actions, had transformed what appeared to be a straightforward murder into something far more complex. But someone added that apple brandy, the inspector insisted, and that's still murder, even if they didn't know about the pepper extract. Miss Marple agreed, though she was increasingly convinced that the person who had added the brandy had indeed known about the planned prank and had deliberately exploited it to create a fatal combination. The key to identifying that person, she believed, lay in understanding who had worn Miss Dane's fairy godmother costume in the church hall kitchen garden at 4 o'clock. She had requested a meeting with Miss Dane at the woman's cottage, and found the actress surprisingly cooperative despite her obvious distress at being considered the prime suspect. "Miss Dane, I need you to think very carefully about your costume yesterday. When did you first put it on?" Miss Dane considered the question. "I brought it to the hall in a garment bag around 2 o'clock. I hung it in the small dressing room behind the stage while I supervised the decoration setup. I didn't actually change into it until nearly 5:30, just before the Fête opened." "So, for 3.5 hours your costume was accessible to anyone who knew where it was kept?" "I suppose so, yes. Though I can't imagine why anyone would want to borrow it. To be seen wearing it while conducting suspicious activities in the garden, thereby directing suspicion toward you." Miss Dane's face paled. "You mean someone deliberately tried to implicate me?" "I believe so. Someone who knew about your disputes with Mr. Thornton and saw an opportunity to commit murder while ensuring you would be blamed." Miss Marple's next visit was to young Sarah Dane, who had been released from police custody but remained under considerable suspicion. "Sarah, when you and Timothy added the pepper extract to the tub, did anyone see you?" "We were very careful to make sure no one was watching. Timothy created a distraction by knocking over some decorations, and while people were looking that way, I quickly poured the thermos contents into the water." "What time was this exactly?" "About 20 minutes before 7. We wanted to do it close to when the adults would start bobbing so the pepper wouldn't dissipate." Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. If Sarah had added the pepper at 6:40 and Mrs. Price Ridley had observed Mr. Thornton adding his mulled cider shortly before 7, then the apple brandy must have been added either between those 2 times or after Mr. Thornton's addition. "Sarah, after you added the pepper, did you leave the thermos behind the refreshment table?" "Yes. I didn't want to be seen carrying it. I planned to retrieve it later and dispose of it." "And during the time between when you added the pepper and when Mr. Thornton bobbed for apples, who else approached the apple bobbing station?" Sarah frowned in concentration. "Several people. Mrs. Henderson was supervising the children's turns. Colonel Bantry walked past several times. And I saw someone in a dark cloak bending down near the tub, but I assumed they were just retrieving a dropped item." A dark cloak. Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to align. "Did you recognize this person?" "Not really. The cloak covered them completely, and with all the costumes it was impossible to tell who anyone was. But Miss Marple had remembered something crucial. Among the various costumes she had observed at the Fête, one person had worn a particularly voluminous dark cloak that would have been perfect for concealing a bottle of apple brandy. She returned home to review her mental notes from that evening, picturing each person and their costume in turn. When the answer came to her, it was with that quiet certainty that came from seeing a pattern complete itself after weeks of observation. The murderer had been hiding in plain sight, using the confusion of costumes and the chaos of the Fête to commit their crime while everyone's attention was directed elsewhere. Chapter 8. The Laughter That Masked Murder. The morning of the 3rd day after the murder brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage, accompanied by Sergeant Lake. The inspector's expression suggested a man who had reached the limits of his patience with a particularly vexing case. "Miss Marple, I understand you've requested this meeting. I hope you have something concrete to share because I'm no closer to identifying who added that brandy than I was 2 days ago." Miss Marple invited them to sit and serve tea with her usual unhurried grace. "Inspector, the solution to this case has been evident from the beginning, though obscured by a series of unfortunate coincidences that made it appear far more complicated than it actually was." She arranged her thoughts carefully before continuing. 3 separate parties contaminated the apple-bobbing water, each acting independently and unaware of the others. Young Sarah and Timothy added pepper extract as a cruel prank. Mr. Thornton added his mulled cider as a misguided attempt to enhance the festivities. And Mrs. Price Ridley, believing she was diluting Thornton's addition, actually added the pepper extract a second time. Yes, we know all this, Inspector Slack said impatiently. But none of these additions would have killed Thornton without the apple brandy. Who added that? The same person who wore Miss Dane's costume in the garden at 4 o'clock. The same person who had access to Colonel Bantry's Wellington boots. The same person who wore a dark cloak during the fête that could conceal a bottle. The same person who had the strongest motive of all for wanting Gerald Thornton dead. Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. And who might that be? Colonel Bantry himself. The inspector's eyebrows rose sharply. The Colonel? But he's the one who reported seeing someone else in the garden. Precisely. He created a false witness account to establish his innocence. But consider the facts, Inspector. Colonel Bantry was at the church hall all afternoon, helping with heavy items. He would have had ample opportunity to borrow Miss Dane's costume, wear it briefly in the garden to be seen by Timothy Wick, then return it before Miss Dane noticed it was gone. His own boots were muddy because he had genuinely been in the garden, preparing the watering can with brandy. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Because Colonel Bantry knew about the young people's prank. He had overheard Sarah and Timothy discussing it while they thought they were alone behind the stage. He realized that if he added alcohol to the mix, their pepper extract would cause Thornton to gasp and inhale the liquid. The combination would be fatal, and the young people would appear to be responsible. Miss Marple paused to let this sink in. Colonel Bantry had compelling reasons to want Thornton dead. The rumours Thornton had been spreading about the Colonel's finances weren't merely malicious gossip. They were true. The Colonel was facing bankruptcy, and Thornton knew it. More significantly, Thornton held several of the Colonel's promissory notes and was threatening to call them in immediately, unless the Colonel agreed to certain business arrangements that would have been ruinous. How do you know this? Because Colonel Bantry has been behaving throughout this investigation like a man with something to hide, but not quite what we expected. His concern wasn't that he would be suspected of murder, but that his financial difficulties would be exposed during the investigation. That's why he tried to retrieve his boots from the church hall. He was afraid they would lead to questions about why he was in the garden, which would lead to questions about his meeting with Thornton, which would expose his financial ruin. Inspector Slack looked sceptical. This is all very interesting speculation, Miss Marple, but do you have any actual proof? I have one piece of evidence that I believe will prove decisive. The bottle of apple brandy found in Miss Dane's pantry, which you assumed she had used to contaminate the water. I suggest you examine it more closely for fingerprints. We did. It had been wiped clean. Exactly. Why would Miss Dane carefully wipe clean a bottle in her own pantry, unless she was deliberately trying to remove someone else's fingerprints? I believe you'll find that Colonel Bantry planted that bottle there after the murder, hoping it would definitively implicate Miss Dane. The inspector's expression had shifted from scepticism to interest. And you can prove the Colonel had access to Miss Dane's cottage? Colonel Bantry has been conducting what he believed was a secret affair with Miss Dane's housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons. He would have had ample opportunity to enter the cottage and plant evidence. Chapter 9. When the laughter stopped. Inspector Slack had moved with admirable speed once Miss Marple laid out her case. A thorough examination of Mrs. Simmons's rooms revealed a cache of love letters from Colonel Bantry, confirming their relationship and providing him with clear access to Miss Dane's cottage. More damning still, a second bottle of apple brandy was discovered hidden in the Colonel's own cellar, its lot number matching the one found in Miss Dane's pantry. Miss Marple sat in the church hall, now cleared of its Halloween decorations, as Inspector Slack prepared to confront Colonel Bantry with the evidence. The Colonel had been summoned on the pretext of providing additional information about his observations in the garden, and he arrived looking distinctly uneasy. "Colonel Bantry," Inspector Slack began without preamble, "I'm afraid I must ask you some questions about your activities on the evening of the Halloween fête." The Colonel's military bearing was firmly in place. "Of course, Inspector, though I've already told you everything I observed." "Have you indeed? Then perhaps you can explain why your fingerprints were found on a bottle of apple brandy hidden in your cellar, a bottle that matches the one found in Miss Dane's cottage." The colour drained from Colonel Bantry's face. I purchased several bottles. Nothing suspicious about that. Nothing suspicious about purchasing matching bottles and leaving one where it would implicate Miss Dane in murder? I think otherwise. Inspector Slack's voice was hard. We also have testimony that you were having an affair with Miss Dane's housekeeper, giving you access to the cottage to plant evidence. Colonel Bantry's shoulders sagged, his facade crumbling. This is absurd. Why would I want Thornton dead? Because he held your promissory notes totalling nearly £10,000, and he was threatening to ruin you publicly unless you agreed to participate in a fraudulent property scheme that would have destroyed your reputation entirely. Miss Marple watched as the Colonel's face went through a series of expressions, calculation, defiance, and finally despair. You can't prove any of this. On the contrary, Miss Marple said quietly, Mr. Thornton's solicitor has provided us with copies of your promissory notes, along with correspondence detailing his plans to expose your financial situation. We also have testimony from young Timothy Wick that he saw someone in Miss Dane's costume in the garden at 4 o'clock, but that person's movements were far too masculine to actually be Miss Dane. You created an elaborate scheme, Colonel, Inspector Slack continued. You borrowed Miss Dane's costume to be seen in the garden, establishing that someone in her clothing was acting suspiciously. You prepared apple brandy in a watering can, intending to add it to the apple-bobbing water, but you needed the right moment, when other circumstances would make the death appear accidental or implicate someone else. That's when you overheard Sarah and Timothy planning their prank with the pepper extract, Miss Marple added. You realised that combining their pepper with your brandy would create a fatal mixture, and the young people would appear to be responsible. You waited until after they had added their pepper, then you approached the tub, wearing your dark cloak, and added the brandy. Colonel Bantry stood silent for a long moment, then slowly sat down, his face buried in his hands. I never meant for it to be so cruel. I just wanted him dead. The pepper was their idea, not mine. I thought the brandy alone might cause him to drown if he panicked, but when I heard about their plan, I realised it would guarantee the result. So, you deliberately exploited children's foolishness to commit murder, Inspector Slack said, with barely concealed disgust. Thornton was going to destroy me. He was going to expose me as a fraud and a failure before the entire village. I couldn't let that happen. The Colonel's voice was hollow. I thought if Miss Dane was blamed or the young people, no one would look at me. I even retrieved my boots to remove evidence, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy them entirely. Because some part of you wanted to be caught, Miss Marple said gently. Some part of you knew this was wrong. Colonel Bantry looked at her with haunted eyes. I heard them laughing, Miss Marple. All evening people were laughing at the fête, having such a good time, and I stood there knowing that I'd turned their celebration into a death trap. When Thornton died, when the laughter stopped, I realised what I'd truly done. Inspector Slack placed the Colonel under arrest, reading him his rights in the sombre quiet of the empty hall. As they led Colonel Bantry away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy that had unfolded. A man had allowed financial desperation and wounded pride to drive him to murder, and in doing so, he had exploited the foolishness of young people and the confusion of innocent parties to mask his crime. The laughter had indeed stopped, and in its place remained only sorrow and regret. Chapter 10. Justice served at last. The week following Colonel Bantry's arrest brought a mixture of relief and sadness to St. Mary Mead. The village had been stunned by the revelation that one of their most respected residents had committed murder, using the joyful chaos of a Halloween fête as cover for his deadly scheme. Miss Marple sat in her cottage on a grey November morning, reflecting on how the case had finally unravelled. Mrs. Bantry had been devastated by her husband's crime, though she had shown remarkable strength in facing the truth. The poor woman had retreated to stay with relatives in Bath, unable to bear the whispers and stares that followed her through the village. Inspector Slack had visited that morning to provide Miss Marple with the final details of the case. Colonel Bantry had ultimately made a full confession, perhaps finding some relief in finally unburdening himself of his guilt. He'd been planning it for nearly a month, the inspector explained over tea, ever since Thornton had given him an ultimatum about the promissory notes. The Colonel had hoped to make it look like a tragic accident, but when that failed, he was prepared to let Miss Dane take the blame. The costume was particularly clever, Miss Marple observed. By being seen in her distinctive fairy godmother outfit, he ensured that suspicion would fall on her, especially given their well-known disputes about rent. Indeed, and planting the brandy bottle in her cottage was meant to seal her fate. Inspector Slack shook his head. "I must admit, Miss Marple, without your observations about the timing and the various additions to that tub, we might never have sorted it all out." The young people, Sarah and Timothy, had been severely reprimanded for their cruel prank, though they would face no formal charges given that their actions, while reprehensible, had not directly caused Mr. Thornton's death. Both had been profoundly shaken by how their foolish joke had become entangled in a murder, and Miss Marple had received a tearful visit from Sarah, promising never again to engage in such thoughtless behaviour. Mrs. Price Ridley had also confessed her role in inadvertently making the situation worse by adding what she thought was more alcohol to dilute the danger, but which had actually been the pepper extract a second time. She had been overcome with guilt, though Miss Marple had gently reminded her that her intentions had been protective, even if her actions had been misguided. "The truly tragic element," Miss Marple said to Mrs. Bantry during a visit several weeks later, "is that none of the individual actions were intended to kill, except for Colonel Bantry's addition of the brandy. It required that precise combination of pepper and alcohol, with Mr. Thornton's own addition of mulled cider adding to the confusion, to create a fatal mixture." "Poor Gerald Thornton," Mrs. Bantry replied sadly. "He was not a kind man, certainly, but he didn't deserve such a death." "No one deserves to be murdered," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I must say, his own actions in pressuring Colonel Bantry so ruthlessly created the desperation that led to his death. Not that this excuses the Colonel's crime, of course, but it does remind us that cruelty often begets cruelty." Miss Felicity Dane had been cleared of all suspicion and had found a new cottage to rent, her financial difficulties eased by a successful production of a Christmas pantomime that had drawn unexpectedly large crowds. The scandal had, ironically, increased interest in the village's theatrical offerings. The church hall had been thoroughly cleaned and redecorated, with all traces of the tragic Halloween fete removed. The Women's Institute had voted unanimously to discontinue the apple-bobbing tradition, replacing it with a safer game of ring toss for future celebrations. As autumn turned to winter and the first frost touched St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the case's resolution. Colonel Bantry's trial would take place in the spring, and the outcome was never in doubt given his full confession. He would spend many years in prison, paying for the moment when financial desperation had overwhelmed his moral compass. The real victims, Miss Marple observed to no one in particular as she sat with her knitting by the fire, are always more numerous than the one who dies. Mrs. Bantry, young Sarah and Timothy, who must live with their guilt, Miss Dane, whose reputation was nearly destroyed, and the entire village that has lost its innocence about what people will do when pressed to desperation. She thought about the laughter that had filled the church hall on that fatal Halloween evening, cut short by a murder that had been masquerading as celebration. Colonel Bantry had relied upon that laughter, upon the confusion and chaos of costumes and games, to conceal his deadly purpose. But as Miss Marple had learned long ago through her careful observation of human nature, murder could never truly hide forever. Truth had a way of emerging from even the most carefully constructed deceptions, particularly when someone was patient enough to notice the small inconsistencies that revealed the larger pattern. The Halloween fete murder had been solved, justice would be served, and life in St. Mary Mead would slowly return to its normal rhythms. But the village would not forget the lesson learned that autumn evening, that even in the midst of laughter and celebration, darkness could lurk, waiting for its moment to strike. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet cottage, content in the knowledge that once again, careful observation and patient reasoning had brought a murderer to justice.